Good evening, or at least, I think it's evening. Time has started to lose meaning these past few days. The world outside isn't the same. We didn't see it at first. It started with whispers, subtle, almost dismissible. Farmers mentioned dry patches in their fields, even though the forecast had called for rain. Fishermen returned from their usual routes, baffled. The river was lower than it had been the day before, and the day before that. But no one panicked. Not yet. Droughts happen, reservoirs drop, seasons shift. That's the way it's always been, right? Right? But then the stories multiplied. A family in a small town along the Missouri River woke up to find their dock stranded on cracked earth. In China, a farmer reported that his well, one that had never run dry in generations, had turned up nothing but dust. And still, no one thought to sound the alarm. Why would they? We believed in explanations. Temporary shortages, climate patterns, miscalculations. But rivers don't just vanish overnight. And yet, they did. It wasn't a slow recession, not a gradual loss. One day, the water was there. The next, it was gone. Gone. No floods, no drainage, no sign of where it had gone. And that's when the phone lines lit up. People were scared. They still thought someone, anyone, had an answer, but no one did. And now? Now, we're left asking the same question we should have asked from the start. What the hell is happening to our water? The station's phone lines have been overwhelmed for days, but this call, this one stuck with me. He was an older man, voice weathered, used to hardship. A farmer calling from somewhere in the Midwest. His words were slow, deliberate. At first, I thought maybe he had a bad connection. Number he was holding back tears. I don't know how else to say it, he murmured. I went to bed last night. The irrigation canals were full. The cattle had water. Everything was fine. A pause, a shuddering breath. And then this morning, nothing. Bone dry. Like it was never there at all. I asked him what he meant by that. Was there a leak? A collapse? A break in the system? His voice dropped to a whisper. I checked the ground myself. The soil's cracked. I dug 6 feet down. No moisture. No mud. No trace that water was ever there. I didn't know what to say. None of us did. Then, before hanging up, he asked a question that sent chills through me. Where did it go? He whispered. Where does water go when it doesn't evaporate, drain, or soak into the earth? I had no answer, and I still don't. At first, the news stations dismissed it. Temporary anomaly. Localized drought conditions. A rare but natural event. That's what the anchors told us, smiling, reassuring, reading their teleprompters as if saying the words made them true. But as the days passed, those explanations stopped making sense. Satellite images showed something unprecedented. Entire rivers missing. Not shrinking, not receding, missing. It started as isolated cases, small creeks, local reservoirs, but then came the first major report. The Amazon River, a lifeline of an entire ecosystem, had gone dry overnight. Within hours, news stations scrambled to retract their earlier claims. Scientists were rushed onto live broadcasts, trying to explain the unexplainable. But they looked pale, uncertain. Then came the reports from Africa. The Nile. The Nile was nothing but a barren path of cracked earth. The Mississippi was next. It was global, simultaneous, and now, for the first time, even the governments looked afraid. Because if the rivers were gone, what would disappear next? And more importantly, who knew this was coming? And said nothing. We told ourselves it was temporary, that it would pass, that nature had a way of balancing itself. Then the lakes disappeared, not drained, not dried up from the sun, gone. It started with the smaller ones. reservoirs, ponds, bodies of water that people only thought about when they needed them. But then it spread. Reports flooded in. Lake Superior was shrinking. The Caspian Sea was retreating. The Dead Sea was already dead. And then the Hoover Dam went dry. That's when it hit. Dams, hydroelectric plants, irrigation systems, entire infrastructures built around water were now useless. Cities that had relied on reservoirs for drinking water had nothing left. Crops withered overnight. And then came the satellite images. At first, no one believed them. They had to be wrong. A glitch. A processing error, but the images showed the same thing. Over and over. The places where water should have been, where water had always been, were empty. No puddles, no mud, no signs of receding shorelines, just dry, cracked earth stretching for miles. And still, no one could explain it. No underground shifts, no major temperature spikes, no evidence of an external force. The water had simply vanished. No warning, no trace. And then the governments. The ones who had been so quick to dismiss this as nothing finally went silent because they didn't have an explanation. Or worse, they did, and they weren't telling us. Then came the moment no one could ignore. A breaking news alert. Urgent. Non-stop coverage. Every channel carried the same message, the same unsettling tone. The Amazon River had run dry. It was supposed to be impossible. A river that large, that deep, that powerful, it didn't just disappear. It didn't just cease to exist overnight, but it had. Then came the Nile, the Mississippi, the Yangtze. The planet's lifelines were gone. Every major river in the world had stopped flowing. The footage was surreal. Empty riverbeds, once full of rushing water, now nothing but abandoned channels of dust and cracked stone. Boats stranded where waves had once carried them. Entire ecosystems collapsing in real time. This wasn't a drought. Droughts don't happen simultaneously across every continent. This was something else, something no one could name. And then, for the first time in human history, the world truly understood what it meant to be without water. And the question, the one that kept me awake, the one that made every new report feel heavier than the last, was simple. Where did it go? Experts were speechless, not because they didn't have theories, because they did, and none of them made sense. The water didn't evaporate. There were no excessive clouds, no rising humidity levels to suggest it had turned to vapor. It didn't drain. There were no shifts in underground aquifers, no evidence of sudden depressions or sinkholes. The water was just gone. A renowned scientist finally admitted it during a late-night broadcast. His voice was calm, but his eyes looked haunted. "This isn't just an environmental event," he said. "It's a physical impossibility. Water doesn't just disappear, but it had. And if water could disappear without a trace, what else could? It happened all at once. One day, people were waiting for answers. The next, they were fighting for survival. Governments had been slow to respond, reluctant to admit how bad things had gotten. They told us to remain calm, to conserve resources. They called it a temporary crisis. But when the rivers vanished, when the lakes dried up overnight, they couldn't deny it any longer. A national state of emergency was declared. But by then, it was too late. Store shelves were stripped bare within hours. People who had never once worried about water found themselves pushing, shoving, clawing at each other for the last remaining bottles. Grocery clerks abandoned their posts as crowds surged through shattered glass doors. The news played footage of cities breaking down. A mother sobbing outside a store, clutching her child, begging someone, anyone, for just a single bottle. An elderly man knocked to the ground and trampled as people rushed past. Lines stretched for miles outside distribution centers, but the water never lasted long enough, and the ones left empty-handed. They didn't go home. They got desperate. And then they got violent. Water became currency. Bottled water, once so common, so cheap, became worth more than gold. And those who had it, well, they weren't safe for long. The first riots erupted in the cities. At first, they were just protests, people demanding answers, demanding water. But demands turned into threats, threats turned into attacks. And within hours, the streets were war zones. People looted homes, searching for hidden stashes. Trucks carrying emergency supplies were ambushed, their cargo stolen before they could even reach distribution centers. In some places, entire neighborhoods were sealed off, people barricading themselves inside, armed, waiting, afraid. There was a story, one that stuck with me. A man was seen sitting outside a gas station, clutching a single water bottle. When asked why he wasn't drinking it, he just smiled and said, "Because the moment I open it, they'll kill me for it." And he wasn't wrong. By nightfall, the fires had started. And then the military arrived. At first, people cheered when they saw the military convoys rolling in. They thought help had arrived, that finally someone was going to fix this. But the soldiers weren't handing out water. They were taking control. Checkpoints were set up. Strict rationing laws were enforced. Armed guards were stationed outside supply centers, ensuring that only those with government-issued vouchers could collect their daily allowance, a single liter per person. But there wasn't enough. People begged, pleaded, offered everything they had. And when that didn't work, they tried to take it. That's when the first shots were fired. The government called it crowd control, but the people on the ground called it something else. A massacre. The world wasn't just thirsty anymore. It was dying. There was a moment, just a brief one, when people thought they could adapt, when they told themselves that they would find a way to survive, that there was still water left somewhere. Then came the sickness. People started drinking from contaminated sources. Ponds, drainage ditches, irrigation canals, places no one should drink from. But when you're desperate, when your throat feels like sandpaper and your skin is burning from the inside out, you don't care about the risk, and the bodies started piling up. Hospitals, already short on supplies, were overrun. Dehydration wasn't the only killer anymore. It was cholera, dysentery, infections that spread like wildfire. Entire families were brought in, one after another, collapsing in the waiting rooms before doctors could even assess them. And then, one night, a nurse made a desperate call to a local news station. Her voice was shaking, barely above a whisper. "They're locking the doors," she said, and turning people away. Not enough beds, not enough medicine. I don't know what happened to her after that. But the hospital stopped taking in patients. And the disease? It kept spreading. I listened to these recordings, and I wonder if any of them are still alive. The messages come from everywhere. Small towns, remote villages, places forgotten by the world. A woman's voice, weak, trembling. "If anyone can hear this, we have nothing left. We're boiling leaves, dirt. My little boy hasn't had water in 2 days. Please, please, someone come." A man, his breathing ragged. There was a convoy. We waited for it. We saw it coming down the highway. And then it just stopped. They never made it here. We don't know why. Some of these messages repeat on a loop, playing long after the people who recorded them have gone silent. One of them still haunts me. A child's voice. No older than 6, maybe 7. "I keep hearing the rain," she says, "but it never touches the ground." That was a week ago. She never called again. There was one hope left. Rain. People waited for it, watching the skies, begging for the relief they knew had to come. And when it finally did, it did something impossible. Reports started coming in, cities where the rain had fallen all night. But in the morning, the streets were just as dry. Farmers who stood outside, arms raised, feeling the drops hit their skin. But when they looked down, The ground was still cracked. The water was gone. A meteorologist, speaking in hushed tones, tried to explain it on live television. "The rain is real," she said, "but it's not staying. It's like something is pulling it away before it can touch the earth." And then came the videos. People standing in the streets, arms outstretched, rain running down their faces, soaking their clothes, but vanishing before it reached the ground. A scientist tried to dismiss it as an illusion. But when they collected the samples, when they tested the soil, there was no moisture, no absorption. It was as if the water had never been there at all. And that's when the real fear began, because if even the sky couldn't save us, then what could? This was the government's latest statement. No explanations, no apologies. Just a cold, scripted response. "We are handling the situation. Remain calm. We ask that all citizens comply with the ongoing efforts to ensure stability." But stability was gone. And then came the rumors. A classified project. A mistake covered up. Something done deliberately. Something that spiraled out of control. "We are handling the situation." That's all they would say. But tell me, why are they acting like they knew this was coming? They say the human body can survive weeks without food, but only a few days without water. But what happens before those days run out? What happens to a mind that knows relief will never come? The first symptom is dryness, lips cracking, tongues swollen, throats raw from the air scraping against them. Then comes fatigue, the body slowing down, conserving what little moisture it has left. But those are just the warnings. The real horror begins after that. Reports started coming in, people seeing things that weren't there, entire families convinced they could hear water flowing beneath their floors, digging through tile and concrete with bare hands until their fingers bled. A man was found miles from his home, cradling an empty glass, whispering that it was full. And then the violence started. Neighbors turned on each other, convinced that someone, anyone, was hiding water. A family was torn apart after a father accused his own children of drinking in secret. He swore he could see water dripping from their mouths. But there was nothing there. One woman, found wandering a deserted street, was still crying when they picked her up. Not out of sadness, out of delirium. She swore she could feel her tears running down her cheeks, swore she was drowning in them. But her face was dry. We are watching something worse than death unfold, a slow unraveling of the mind, and with each hour that passes, more people are losing their grip. They found it in the dust, a leather-bound notebook left behind in a place where no one had been for days. The entries are shaky, words slanted, like they were written by a trembling hand. The first pages describe a village desperate for water, waiting for government aid that never came. Then the rationing began. Then the accusations. By the time the final entries were written, the village had turned against itself. We stopped speaking, stopped trusting. I saw my neighbor kill a man today over a bottle that turned out to be empty. We're not human anymore. We're something else. The next page is written in uneven, jagged lines. They took the well. They're guarding it with guns. But I looked. There's nothing left. Just darkness. And then the last words, scrawled so frantically that the ink bleeds through the page. They drank the dust. No one knows what that means. But when they found what was left of the village, there wasn't a single body. Not one. Some people believe this is punishment. Not just a disaster, not just a freak event, but something deliberate. Across the world, desperate voices are turning to faith. Some claim the rivers have dried because mankind has angered something greater, that the water is being taken back, not by nature, but by a force that no one can name. One group has been making broadcasts of their own. Their leader, voice ragged from thirst, speaks in whispers. "You should not be afraid of dying of thirst. You should be afraid of what comes after." And then there are the others, the ones who believe this isn't divine judgment, but something else entirely. A scientist from a collapsed research facility made a final transmission before disappearing. "This isn't natural," he said. His voice was shaking. "We took something we weren't supposed to, and now it's being corrected." The transmission ended there. No one has heard from him since. His name was Dr. Ellis, a physician. A man who had spent decades treating illnesses, saving lives, until there were no lives left to save. His voice was weak when he made the call, dry, strained, the kind of voice that belonged to someone too far gone to be helped. "I thought I had more time," he whispered, "but this is faster than I expected." He'd kept a record of the human body's decline without water. First thirst, then fatigue, then confusion. The organs begin shutting down, slowly at first, then all at once. The blood thickens, the skin cracks, the mind unravels, and then the seizures start. But what scared him wasn't the symptoms, it was what came after. "People aren't just dying," he said. "They're stopping." I asked him what he meant, but he didn't have an answer. People didn't collapse, didn't convulse. They just stood still, eyes unfocused, bodies rigid. And then, when someone tried to shake them, dust. That was his last report. I tried to reach him again, but all I got was silence. There's a stretch of road in the Southwest that people don't travel anymore. Not after what happened to the convoy. The trucker, his name was Gabe, made his last transmission from that road. His voice was tight, rushed, afraid. "It was supposed to be a simple run," he said. "Water rations, 30 trucks. We were headed toward a relief zone. But—" He trailed off. Something had gone wrong. The air changed, felt heavy, like breathing in sand. Then the first truck stopped. Just stopped. No brakes, no warning. One by one, the rest of them stalled. Radios cut to static. Engines wouldn't turn over. That's when they saw it. There was something in the dust, moving through it, watching. The others got out, started walking. But Gabe, he stayed in his cab. Then he heard it. Not footsteps, not voices, something else. His last words before the radio cut out were barely a whisper. "They're not just taking the water." No bodies were ever found. The trucks remained, untouched, empty. And the road? It hasn't been the same since. At first, it was just the water. Then it was the animals. At first, people thought they'd wandered off, searching for something to drink. But no bones, no remains, just empty pastures, silent forests, cages filled with nothing but dust. Then, entire towns went quiet. Not abandoned, vacant, no signs of struggle, no footprints leading away, cars still parked in driveways, meals left half-eaten on tables, houses untouched, as if their owners had just stepped outside and never returned. And then someone found the footprints, dozens of them circling an empty well, some large, some small, all leading inward, none leading out, and in the center of them all, nothing. No one speaks of those towns anymore. No one goes to them, because the ones who do, they don't come back. First, it was the independent stations, the small local broadcasts run by people trying to make sense of the crisis. They started cutting out one by one. At first, we thought it was interference, power outages, equipment failures. But then, the bigger networks followed. One moment, they were live, reporters on air, voices shaking as they read the latest updates. And then, silence, just static. Government-backed stations were the last to go dark. But when they did, it wasn't a sudden cutoff. It was slow, deliberate. First, they stopped taking live calls. Then, they stopped airing raw footage. And then, they vanished completely. No explanation, no final message, just a black screen where the news used to be. The last thing I heard from one of the major networks was a reporter arguing with someone off camera, their voice rising in panic. You can't just shut this down. People need to know. Then the signal cut. Since then, nothing. And now we're left in the dark, not just about what's happening, but about what's coming next. After the media blackout, the government took control of the message. They held a press conference, the first in days. It should have been a moment of clarity, of reassurance, but instead, it was carefully staged, painfully scripted. A single official stood before the cameras, eyes empty, voice calm to the point of being unnatural. We are handling the situation. That was their message, over and over. Remain calm. We are handling the situation. We are working toward a solution. But there was no solution. No one asked about the vanishing rivers. No one mentioned the rain that no longer touched the ground. And when reporters tried to press for answers, they were met with forced smiles and vague responses. People are overreacting. Everything is under control. But it wasn't. And the more they repeated their empty promises, the more obvious it became. They were lying. The leak happened late last night. A classified military memo, one that was never meant to reach the public. But someone, somewhere, decided the world needed to see it. Operation Reservoir. That was the title stamped across the document. It wasn't about finding water. It was about something else, something deliberate. The pages that surfaced were heavily redacted, entire sections blacked out, but the pieces that remained, they were enough. Mentions of extraction efforts, discussions about containment, a section labeled Phase 1 complete, and then, the most chilling line of all, projected outcomes remain within acceptable loss parameters. Acceptable loss. That was the phrase they used, as if the deaths, the suffering, the complete collapse of life as we knew it was part of a plan. And if Phase 1 was complete, then what was Phase 2? They sent people to find answers. At first, it was just a few independent reporters, those who weren't bound by government contracts, the ones who still believed in truth. They traveled to the dried riverbeds, to the places where the water had once been, armed with nothing but cameras and questions. And then they disappeared. At first, no one noticed, but their families did, their colleagues, their stations. Calls went unanswered, emails bounced back. The few journalists who did return came back changed, their eyes hollow, their voices thin. And none of them would speak about what they saw, not on record. One of them, a man who had spent years covering war zones, corruption, and all the horrors in between, sent a final cryptic message to a friend. Don't go near the riverbeds. If you do, you won't come back the same. Then he vanished too. And that's when the whispers began. Did they find something, or did someone make sure they never did? Because if the government wanted the truth hidden, then what did the journalists see? People want to believe in coincidence. They want to believe that the rivers dried on their own, that the government was just as blindsided as the rest of us, that the missing journalists, the vanishing reports, the classified memos were all unrelated. But that's getting harder to believe, because now a new rumor is spreading, one that suggests the government knew this was coming, that they weren't caught off guard at all. Old documents have surfaced, reports from years ago, discussing water scarcity, contingency plans, and population management projections. They talk about what would happen if the world's water supply were to suddenly vanish. Not when, if. And that phrasing is important, because it means someone was considering the possibility. Someone was preparing for it. But if they were preparing, then they must have known. And if they knew, why didn't they warn us? People have started seeing them. The trucks, the helicopters, the unmarked vehicles that appear near the dried up riverbeds, moving in silence, coming and going in the dead of night. No insignias, no markings, no way to tell who they belong to. At first, people thought they were relief teams, scientists, cleanup crews. But they aren't delivering water. They aren't helping anyone. They're just watching. Someone managed to get close enough to one of the convoys, a risk he shouldn't have taken. He watched as men in hazmat suits unloaded equipment, machines that hummed with a sound he'd never heard before. They weren't studying the riverbeds. They were doing something to them. And when they noticed him, they didn't chase him. They didn't yell. One of them simply lifted a hand and pointed directly at him. That was all it took. He ran. He hasn't been seen since. But if the government is trying to contain something, then what exactly is there to contain? Science was supposed to save us. When the rivers dried up, when the lakes vanished, we turned to the experts. We waited for explanations, for theories, for someone to tell us how to reverse whatever was happening. But there were no answers. Water follows rules. It evaporates, it drains, it freezes, it moves somewhere. But this defied everything we understood about physics, about nature, about the fundamental laws of reality. Satellite readings showed nothing. No mass relocation of water vapor, no sudden rise in atmospheric moisture, no unexpected shifts in ocean currents. It wasn't draining into the ground. Soil samples were just as dry at 10 feet deep as they were on the surface. One scientist, someone who had dedicated their entire career to studying hydrodynamics, spoke in a hushed interview before the broadcast was pulled. "This isn't a water crisis," she said. "This is a physics crisis. Because water doesn't just cease to exist. Not unless something is taking it. And if something is taking it, then we aren't dealing with a disaster. We're dealing with an extraction." It was an old report, unpublished, meant to be buried, but it wasn't. A former NASA researcher, who now remains unnamed, leaked fragments of a study conducted nearly a decade ago, a study that had been classified and quietly discarded. At the time, the data was dismissed as an error, an unexplained glitch in their deep space monitoring systems. But in light of what's happening now, it doesn't seem like an error anymore. The report detailed unexplained energy readings, a fluctuation in gravitational forces near Earth, not large enough to affect planetary movement, but enough to be noticed by sensitive instruments. The origin point? The riverbeds. This was years before the first reports of receding water, years before anyone noticed anything was wrong. One section of the report, before it was redacted, contained a single line that sent a chill through me. Anomalous gravitational inconsistencies detected, possible external influence, ongoing extraction remains undetermined. Extraction. That word again, and if they knew this was happening years ago, then why didn't they warn us? Not everyone was surprised. There were those who had been talking about this for years. Warnings in old texts, half-forgotten myths, stories dismissed as superstition. A paranormal investigator, someone who had spent years studying ancient prophecies, contacted the station with something chilling. The rivers were never just rivers, he said. They were boundaries. He went on to explain that in ancient cultures across the world, rivers weren't just water sources. They were barriers between realms. They separated the land of the living from the land of the dead. They held something back. And the moment they disappeared, that meant whatever was on the other side was no longer trapped. Sumerian tablets speak of the water bearers leaving and the land becoming dry as bone. An old Hopi prophecy speaks of the rivers turning to dust and the sky losing its tears. And then there was the final line in his notes, written in Old Latin, long before any of this started. It translates to, "When the rivers are empty, the earth shall remember." But the question is, what does the earth remember? And are we about to find out? The rivers didn't just disappear, they left something behind. Satellite images taken after the vanishing water revealed something no one could explain. At first, they were dismissed as natural formations, cracks, erosion, patterns in the dried mud. But then the images kept coming. From the Amazon, the Nile, the Mississippi, and the patterns were the same. Perfectly symmetrical lines stretching across the empty riverbeds, too precise, to be random. Some curved like spirals. Others crisscrossed into grids. A few looked almost written. One linguist, someone who specializes in ancient languages, took one look at the images and refused to speak about them again. Another researcher, one braver or more reckless than the rest, published a preliminary report before his funding was mysteriously revoked. These markings follow no known geological process. They are deliberate, designed. They are meant to be read. But read by whom? And more importantly, who put them there? They tried to silence him. For days, the leak was just a rumor. A whisper about a scientist who had gone into hiding after stumbling upon something he wasn't supposed to know. But then, he made contact. A brief, frantic phone call. A voice distorted, trembling, speaking too fast, as if he wasn't sure how much time he had. "This isn't climate change," he said. "It's extraction." I asked him what he meant. "You don't understand. The water wasn't destroyed. It wasn't lost. It was taken." "Taken by who?" Silence. Then, a breath. A decision. "There are things beneath us. Things we weren't supposed to wake up. The rivers weren't just carrying water. They were keeping something buried. A sound in the background. A sharp inhale. I have to go." The line went dead. I tried calling back. The number no longer existed. It was bound to happen. We just didn't want to believe it. The breaking news alert came in the middle of the night. A blurry live feed. A reporter struggling to find the words. "The Atlantic is receding." And then the footage. Miles of exposed ocean floor stretching into the horizon. Places that should have been underwater, now bare and cracked. Tidal waves weren't responsible. There was no seismic activity, no massive shifts in pressure. The water simply vanished. Scientists scrambled for answers. Governments issued statements of denial. But the truth was right in front of us. The oceans were going dry. And if the rivers were warnings, then the oceans were the final stage, because the rivers were boundaries. They were pathways. They were containment. But the oceans, they're doors. And now something has opened them. This may be my last broadcast. I don't know who's still out there. I don't know if anyone can even hear this anymore. The airwaves are mostly silent now. Just static, where voices used to be. I'm exhausted. My throat is raw. I haven't had water in over a day. But I keep talking because what else is left? People used to send messages. Desperate voices calling in from across the country, hoping for answers. Now? Now the phones are dead. The internet is gone. The world has gone quiet. The station generator is running low. I've stretched the fuel as long as I could. But soon, the lights will flicker out. And then this place. This last piece of normalcy, of connection, will go dark too. I don't know what's happening outside. I don't know if the cities are still standing, if the convoys made it to wherever they were going. All I know is that water is gone, and something else has taken its place. I hear sounds in the distance sometimes. Not voices, not machines. Something else. Something old. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up, but if anyone is still listening, please tell me I'm not the last one left. People are still moving, still searching for something. Reports, if you can call them that, say thousands have left the cities, abandoning everything, heading toward a so-called safe zone. But no one knows if it's real. Some say it's deep in the mountains where the rivers used to flow. Others claim it's a military outpost, a place where the government still has resources, still has water. But no one who leaves ever comes back to confirm it. A convoy of survivors passed near the station yesterday. They didn't stop, didn't even look in my direction. They were hollow-eyed, skin sunken, clutching their last bottles like lifelines. I called out to one of them, asked where they were going. He didn't answer. He just pointed toward the horizon. That was the last I saw of them. Are they running toward something? Or away from something? And if it's the latter, what are they running from? People don't go near the riverbeds anymore, not because of the emptiness, not because of the silence, because of what's in them now. There are whispers, too many to ignore. Survivors moving along the old water routes claim they've seen things watching them. Not animals, not people, something else. One man, half delirious from thirst, swore he saw figures standing in the riverbeds. Tall, motionless, shaped like people, but not. He said they didn't walk, didn't breathe, just stood in the dry cracks where water once flowed. And when he blinked, they were closer. Another traveler spoke of hearing a sound coming from the riverbed at night. A low hum, a whispering noise almost like water rushing through stone. But there was no water, only dust. And the worst story, the one I can't shake, a woman traveling alone spoke of something following her, not on the roads, not in the ruins, only when she was near a dry river. She swore she could feel something pulling at her, like a current, dragging her toward the center of the empty channel. She ran, but she said she could still hear it, calling, whispering, like it was waiting for her to come back. And now, I wonder, did the water really disappear? Or did something take its place? The transmission came through just minutes ago. A voice, urgent, ragged, cutting in and out through the static. Military frequency, not meant for civilians. I don't know how I picked it up. Maybe they were broadcasting to anyone who would listen. Maybe they knew there wasn't anyone left to receive it. Copy. Does anyone copy? This is Echo 7. We have lost containment. Repeat, we have lost containment. Lost containment. The voice kept going, rushed, desperate, words barely forming before they collapsed into static. Tried to stop them. They're not human. We didn't understand. Gunfire in the background. A scream, short, choked off. Then silence except for one final breath. And then the last words. The only ones that came through clearly. We failed. Run. Silence. I don't know where the transmission came from. A base, a bunker, a last stand somewhere in the wasteland. All I know is that they tried to stop something, and they didn't. This is it. The signal is fading. The generator is almost dry. My hands are shaking. My vision is blurred. I don't know how many people are still listening. Maybe no one. Maybe I'm speaking into nothing. But if you can hear me, if you're still out there, find water. Stay hidden. Don't trust anyone who promises a safe place. There are no safe places. I've done my best to bring you the truth, to make sense of the madness. But I don't think there's anything left to understand. The rivers are gone. The oceans are disappearing. The world as we knew it is over. And now, whatever was beneath us, whatever we thought was just stories, myths, warnings ignored, is waking up. I don't have answers. I don't know what's real anymore. But I do know this. Don't go near the dried riverbeds. If you see something moving in the dust, don't stop to look. If you hear something whispering from below, don't listen. Run. And if no one is left to run, then I hope somehow this recording survives longer than I did. I was about to sign off, but then I heard it. A sound, faint at first, like a whisper carried on dead air. It wasn't static, not feedback, not a malfunction. It was something else. I turned up the volume, listened. The sound grew, low, resonant, a frequency that made my teeth ache, made my head pound, made my skin crawl like it wanted to peel itself away. It wasn't human. It wasn't mechanical. It was something in between. A rhythm, pulsing, methodical, like something was calling out or responding. I wanted to turn it off. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to turn it off, but I couldn't, because buried in the noise Beneath the deep, shuddering hum, I could hear voices, hundreds of them, thousands, not speaking, not screaming, repeating a single phrase, layered over itself, distorted, echoing from a place no voice should be coming from. And as the power flickered, as the last of the generator gave out, and the station was swallowed by darkness, I finally understood what they were saying. The rivers remember. Then the radio went silent. And so did I. This is it. Maybe you're listening to this days from now, weeks, maybe years. Maybe this broadcast is the last piece of history, the final record of a world that didn't understand the warning signs until it was too late. But if you're still here, if you're still listening, then that means it's not over yet. And maybe, just maybe, there's still a choice to be made. The rivers are gone. The oceans are vanishing. Something is waking up. But the real question isn't what happens next. The real question is, what would you do? If everything you knew was collapsing, if the rules of the world were rewritten in an instant, where would you go? What would you hold on to? Who would you trust? Would you keep searching for answers? Or would you accept that some questions were never meant to be asked? And maybe the most unsettling question of all, what if the rivers didn't disappear? What if they just moved? And what if they're waiting for us to follow? Let me know in the comments. What would you do if you were the last one listening to this broadcast? Would you run? Would you fight? Would you keep searching? Your thoughts matter more than you know. If you found this broadcast intriguing, if it made you think, if it sent chills down your spine, don't let it stop here. Share it with someone, a friend, a family member, someone who would want to hear this. And if you want more stories like this, more mysteries, more broadcasts, more questions that have no easy answers, subscribe. Because in the end, the signal only survives as long as someone is listening. And right now, I'm still here. Are you?